I got some great questions this past week about whether or not teaching kids syntax and grammar is something that's actually going to be useful for them in the real world and in life. So I wanted to pop in and just answer that question really quickly. Before I get going, I'm Karen Dudek-Brannan, and I help pediatric therapists be better leaders so that they can make a bigger impact with their services. And part of what I do is that I do have some programs for speech pathologists and other professionals that are working on language and literacy to help them to build the skills that kids need in order to be strong readers and writers. So that's part of what I do. And so in one of my programs, we talk a lot about how to build the language and the vocabulary skills that kids need in order to support comprehension and a lot of the academic work that they're doing in the school settings so that they can read and gain information from what they're reading and write and perform all of those different things that are going to be useful in academic tasks that are going to help them get through school and eventually prepare them for the real world. So I think that there's a lot of debate going on. I see a lot of posts and discussions where, people are really questioning if schools are actually teaching kids skills that are going to be useful for the real world. And when it comes to language, there's a lot of debate with teaching the mechanics of sentences and how useful that is. And the perspective that I come from is that a lot of the therapists that I mentor, especially in my programs for SLP specifically, a lot of the clinicians that I'm working with, they have a 30-minute per week therapy session where they have these kids and they have to figure out how to make every second count. And a lot of times there's so many different things that they could be working on, and there's a lot of different skills that kids need in order to be successful. And so it can be really hard to prioritize. And then there's a lot of information out there, a lot of professional development seminars. It can be really hard to kind of piece it together. So it can be really challenging for clinicians to sift through all of that. So that's why I do what I do. I sift through all that information and really just funnel it down to what the evidence says, my own clinical practice, and what I know from mentoring clinicians. And really, when it comes to language, one of the things that people need to understand is that if kids have that profile, especially if they have language processing issues, and if they do not have the underlying language skills needed to decode efficiently. So when they come to a word, if it takes them a lot of energy to figure out what that word actually says, because maybe they don't have the phonological awareness skills, they don't have an awareness of the parts of the words, so the morphemes. If they can't just automatically decode a word, it's going to cause an issue with cognitive load, and that's going to cause some breakdown. And then something else that comes up that's often not addressed with these particular students that don't have the underlying language skills to support comprehension is that they don't have a sense of how to put a sentence together. And as a result, it's hard for them to comprehend one sentence at a time. And then obviously they're not getting the big picture because they're having that breakdown at the sentence level. It's obviously going to be hard to get the entire message of a paragraph that you're reading if you can't get the message behind one sentence. And so a lot of times when we're talking about vocabulary, kids need to know the meaning behind words, but they also need to know the function behind words. And that has to do with syntax and how sentences are put together. So that's why a big part of what I do with for SLPs, it comes back to teaching kids the strategies to help them understand the different parts of the sentence so that they can get the meaning behind it, so they can kind of develop that picture in their head of what that message is actually saying. And so sometimes people will say, like, doesn't just, repeating sentences or drilling worksheets and doing fill in the blank exercises, a lot of the things that you might see on sites like Teachers Pay Teachers for working on syntax, people question that because they think, is that really functional? Well, if that's all you're doing, if you're doing these kind of rote drill types of things and that's it, then obviously that's not going to be helpful. But the key is that we want to work on, number one, the right sentence types that are actually causing the breakdown. And one of those sentence types is complex sentences that use subordination. So if there's subordinate conjunctions, this is a big thing that helps kids to string thoughts together when they're writing, or and just kind of putting their thoughts together in a more sophisticated way. So that is one thing that can make a big impact. And the ability to process and understand complex sentences can also have a big impact on comprehension. So that is something that also impacts reading comprehension as well. So working on complex sentences makes a big difference, because those students often don't have those skills. And so sometimes people will say, well, don't kids need to be able to, get the big picture? And why do these other kids over here, why are they doing fine in the classroom without this level of instruction and these other kids aren't? Well, a lot of times if kids are struggling with language, there's certain kids who just need certain things to be taught to them more explicitly in a more intensive situation. So if kids are getting special education services, if they're requiring language therapy, then those are the kids that where the general education instruction isn't going to be enough. They are going to need some of those skills taught directly. Now, of course, the secret to making sure that they're functional is giving them a blend of both. There are a lot of skills, especially when it comes to things like reading and phonics and direct instruction of specific sentence types that are causing comprehension breakdowns. There are a lot of those types of skills that can actually be addressed really well in kind of a pull-out, small group, one-on-one type of situation. And a lot of people are concerned about that because they think that's not functional. That's not a functional setting where you're using language. Well, that's true, but they do need some of the work done in that type of situation so that they can build those skills. And then they also need some experience using those skills in more functional situations. But if you just have one or the other, then you're going to have a breakdown. If you just push kids out into a situation where they have to integrate a lot of language skills at once without teaching the foundation, then they're not even going to have a foundation to pull from, and there's going to be a breakdown. Whereas if you only teach kids skills in a very structured situation and you don't give them experience with the application, then kids aren't ever going to learn to apply those foundational skills. So a lot of times people get caught in these either or discussions, like, language should be functional. And then some people are like, well, but what about these other skills that they don't have? Well, it's not an either or thing. It's both. Kids need experience in real life situations. They also need some direct work on some of these skills that appear more academic. It's both. So I actually talk about this particular topic. I dive into a little bit more about some specific examples of how SLPs or other professionals who are working on sentence structure, how they can kind of hit this balance of giving kids enough structure in certain academic situations that they build those skills, and then also kind of just flowing into some more functional things so that they can apply. I give some examples of how to structure that in a recent podcast episode that I released on the Are They 18 Yet podcast, which is a podcast for therapists, educators, and also parents who are interested in learning ways that we can support K-12 kids so that they can grow up and be fully functional, well-adjusted adults. So to learn more about that episode and to get access to that episode where I talk about how to make syntax instruction functional and relevant to the real world, you can check out my website where I publish all of my podcast episodes. Again, it's the Are They 18 Yet podcast. You're going to want to go to drkarendudek-brannan.com/blog. And this is episode 70. As I'm recording this video, it is the most recently published episode, so it'll be the first one on the blog. But if you're watching this video later on, then you're just going to want to scroll through and get episode 70. And you can also subscribe to Are They 18 Yet on all of the podcast directories.